Good day and welcome back. In this segment of differential reinforcement, we focus on DRO, sometimes referred to as DRZ, because we're working on decreasing the number of displays of a highly inappropriate action immediately to non-existence, the Z for zero outbursts during a set time period. DRO is a technique that involves reinforcing, rewarding a student if an undesirable action is not displayed at all during a designated time period. You will differentially reinforce, meaning reward under certain conditions, the absence of the behavior for a certain time period. The approach is positive in nature in that the student's behavior is either reinforced or ignored. In its typical form, no punishment is involved. Although a traditional form of DRO required a one-to-one teacher-student ratio with independent observers to record data, modifications can easily be made to allow for its use in the classroom, the workshop, or the home environment. DRO is especially well suited for decreasing frequent, severe, and repetitive behaviors, even in youngsters who have impaired cognitive abilities. In DRO, DRZ, the student receives a payoff, reinforcement if and when the identified action, one that must be eliminated from his or her behavioral repertoire, is non-existent during the entire period of time that we identify. Any demonstration of that behavior, however small or brief, during the set time period results in no reinforcement being given by us. Yes, the focus of DRO is to eliminate a response, causing it to be fully and forever dropped from his or her behavior pattern. But what about those other unacceptable actions that the youngster displays? Don't worry, you'll get to them. But right now, you're focusing on the worst behavior, so to speak. Once it is eliminated, you can then focus on the next one on your list. So, if you're working on reducing the hitting of others, that youngster might still cuss and threaten. But if the negative physical contact is withheld, not shown at all, that student receives reinforcement when the designated time period has elapsed. In DRO, we're essentially saying, show me any other behavior, just not that one. Yes, she slammed the desktop 3 times during the time span, but she did refrain from shouting out the behavior we're focusing upon. The learner gets reinforcement for doing so during the just expired interval. Let's break down this intervention into its steps to be followed. In step 1, as with any ABA procedure, we have to specifically define behaviors in observable and measurable terms. How to do so is addressed in another session here on Behavior Advisor, the one regarding behavioral recording and data recording. In step 2, we then select a reinforcer that we know will motivate the youngster to put forth his or her best effort. Step 3, now we select a time interval during which there must be an absence of the behavior in question in order for our student to gain a reward. This time span can be determined in two ways. The first way is to go forward with a guesstimate as to how long the youngster can corral that action. Or we can use the more precise method of mathematically pinpointing the exact to-the-second length of time that we should use for determination of success or failure on the youngster's part. Success being the absolute absence of the defined behavior during the set interval. In a minute, we'll talk about how that time interval is determined. Step 4. Successful cessation of the behavior for the entire duration of the time interval results in reinforcement for the student. In another Behavior Advisor session in our ABA series, we'll discuss how to modify the presentation of reinforcement for optimal effect in building and later maintaining behaviors. Look for schedules of reinforcement. If the undesirable action is displayed, we have two options. In the first, we wait until the end of the set time period when we'll withhold reinforcement and then restart the timer to the beginning of the next predetermined time span. Can you imagine some of the concerns with this practice versus the second choice of restarting the clock when the errant action is displayed? Pause the podcast to give the matter some thought. Correct. If we're going to let the identified time period run its full course after the display of the undesirable behavior, why would the youngster then strive to restrain that action? There's nothing more to lose. It's usually a better practice path to restart the interval upon the display of the aberrant action. One note for those folks working with students who are severely cognitively disabled or learners who engage in repetitive behaviors. You may wish to stop the errant action by restraining it when it's displayed. For rocking back and forth, you might gently hold the head still. For a pupil who is flapping hands, you might bring the palms together and couch the hands in yours. While restraining the action, state the behavior, the action that you do wish to see. Instead of saying, "No rocking," we say, "Sit still." Instead of "No flapping," we say, "Hands on lap." As you heard in the Verbal Aikido webinar session here on Behavior Advisor, we need to state which actions to show and avoid statements telling kids what not to do. We know that the brain does not register void words, don't, not, never. The brain waits for the action word that follows. By saying don't do something, we're actually suggesting it to the youngster. The DRO procedure is very powerful. While you might actually witness an initial day or two increase in the behavior that you're trying to eliminate, that trend reverses quickly and rates of behavior drop drastically over a short course of time. On the average, you can expect the time intervals between displays of that undesirable behavior to double in length each day. You may have to decrease valuable instructional time at the beginning of the intervention in order to deal with that behavior of concern, but you will gain back instructional time in spades as the program progresses. You will want to continue to increase the time interval in order to challenge the youngster to perform even better than the new best. In the informal version, with student success, you might increase the time segment by 30 seconds or a minute. With the precise version, you'll be using a formula that we'll see in just a bit to calculate the new interval for reinforcement for use later today or tomorrow. To do so, you'll need data on the action, so be sure that you've made a tally mark when that behavior occurred. For those tally marks to be helpful, remember that you need a behavior that was defined with specificity and is observable and measurable. Something covered fully in the session on behavioral recording and data collection. When you're engaging in the more precise version of DRO, you'll calculate the span of time known as the IRT, the Interresponse Time, or time that elapses between displays of the behavior that we defined. You'll be making sense of data you've collected during earlier sessions when you were observing the youngster's performance in withholding his or her errant action. As you engage in your intervention, you will continue to collect data on the youngster's progress, making those tally marks, and then using that data to adjust the time span, the IRT, for maximum positive effect. Remember, you can learn the various data collection procedures by tuning in to our BehaviorAdvisor.com podcast on behavior data recording. So, the IRT is the usual amount of time that transpires between displays of the behavior that we wish to extinguish. It's the mathematical average. Known as frequency recording, you'll be keeping count of the number of outbursts of the behavior during your observation period. Take, for example, Ali, who makes a self-derogatory remark like, "I'm stupid," or "I'll never understand this stuff," 6 times in your 1-hour observation period. Gee, that's how many minutes between episodes? 6 times in 1 hour? Right, 6 displays divided into 60 minutes means you have an average IRT, interresponse time, time between displays, of, 10 minutes between demonstrations of those actions. That IRT means that you are going to reinforce Ali for every 10 minutes that he manages to hold in these verbal outbursts. Perhaps he earns a point toward the 50 needed to trade them in for a privilege or a prize. At the same time, we might be working to have him display an alternative behavior to putting himself down when he makes mistakes. Perhaps saying, "I need to remember the formula," or chanting a mantra like, "I'm trying and mistakes happen when you're learning." But that DR procedure is explained in another podcast, the one on differential reinforcement of alternative and incompatible behaviors. Right now, though, let's talk a bit more about how we determine that IRT. Here you'll see the simplified formula in which we create a fraction, with the top number, the numerator, being the number of time segments, the number of time periods, and we place that over the denominator that identifies the number of times that the behavior of concern was demonstrated during that observation or intervention period of ours that day. So, In this example, during a 30-minute period of time, Carmen uttered 6 offensive words. You reduce the fraction to 5/1 or 5. But what is the meaning of that numeral? Oh yes, Carmen cussed once every 5 minutes on the average. That 5 minutes is our new IRT, the period of time that Carmen must refrain from uttering those awful words in order to gain reinforcement. Perhaps as we look back through our records, we note the progress of the youngster who used to have an IRT of 1 minute and 37 seconds between offensive words. That lengthened to a time span of 2 minutes and 44 seconds, then 3 minutes and 56 seconds, and now 5 minutes even. We're optimistic that the IRT will continue to expand until cursing is quite rare or non-existent. Here's another example of calculating the IRT. Our buddy Cliff is using what we refer to as inappropriate physical contact. Periodically he pushes, pokes, or slaps other students. In fact, he's doing this an average of 9 times during the 6-hour school day. We know that from the data we've collected and making a tally mark every time it's happened. We figure, let's go with DRO. Let's rid Cliff of this behavior. Let's do it quickly. So in order to determine the time span we're going to use, the amount of time that Cliff has to go with no inappropriate physical contact, that negative touch, crunch the numbers, make sense of your data, pause the podcast, use the formula. All right, we see a fraction of 6/9. We know we're going to reduce that to 2/3. But 2/3 of what? Oh yeah, 2/3 of the time unit that we're using here, hours, 6 hours a day. And we know there are 60 minutes in an hour. If you haven't gotten this far, pause the podcast again, keep working on that formula. Yes, the interval length of 40 minutes is going to be set as the amount of time that he must refrain from physically contacting peers in a negative manner. And we're going to continue to collect data. We're going to figure out the new interval for the next day or after lunch, because we expect that this behavior is going to reduce in frequency rather quickly. And we want to be sure that Cliff is challenged, but a challenge that he can meet. One last one. We have a student who engages in scripting, repeating something heard on television or a video, pretty much verbatim. Our young lady, Kanai, displayed 8 of these short scripting incidents. Gosh, it happened during our 20-minute observation. So what's your IRT, your reinforcement interval, going to be? Plug the numbers into the formula, pause the podcast. We put 20, the number of minutes, the number of time units that we're using. We're dividing it by the number of scripting incidents. Gee, 8 into 20, let's do the division. Yeah, 8 goes into 20 2.5 times. 2 and 4/8, we reduce the 4/8 to a half. But 2.5 what? Oh yeah, those time units that we're using, minutes. So Kanai has to go 2.5 minutes or 150 seconds with no displays of scripting in order to get that reinforcement that we have for her. Now, how do we keep track of these odd times? And what if we get something like 4 minutes and 12 seconds? How are we going to keep track of this? Well, there's an app for that. Or you can stop by your local electronics store for a device that you can set to sound a tone at set time intervals. It might also be wise to obtain a device with a randomizing function too, so that you can use it for other types of behavioral recording that are explained in the session of that name. So, what are some of the cautions that we should be keeping in mind when we're making use of DRO? First of all, we're at risk for reinforcing other behaviors that are socially unpalatable. We might want to use instead DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, or DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, if this proves to be a concern. Those procedures are presented in other podcasts, other sessions of this DR series here on behavioradvisor.com. In the second point, we educators and supervising adults are at risk for creating a behavioral void for our youngsters. We want to be sure that we use DRO with youngsters who have a large repertoire of socially acceptable behaviors that could fill that emptiness. Or we select another DR procedure like DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, that promote a replacement behavior that meets the same need as the undesirable one. And of course, the reinforcers and the amounts of reinforcement are crucial. In the third point, the benefits that accrue to a new behavior, the youngster showing a new action, must be greater than the reinforcement or the payoff for the present action. And withholding that present action, what's the payoff? What's the benefit? It might be that we're better off using another DR procedure. That concludes the session on differential reinforcement of other behaviors. I'm Tom McIntyre, Dr. Mac. Thanks for joining me for another podcast from behavioradvisor.com.